it up for this amazing conference. Today, we're almost towards the end here. We're about to round it out. I'm going to start today off by talking a little bit about blind spots and bents. It all starts with a photo of me from college. This is me. I was an art major with a graphic design specialization, and I loved typography. I had a professor who got me really involved in the whole process of typography. And back then, we didn't put our portfolios on the web or in PDFs. We put them in these giant black briefcases. Anybody here remember these? They were a real pain to lug around, weren't they? So inside of these black briefcases, there were blackboards. We'd print out our work and paste them up on those blackboards using a substance called 3M Super 77. This is industrial strength glue. It will bond metal to plywood, and it says it there on the can. At the same time, my family had a dog. Her name was Missy. She was a very cute miniature schnauzer and extremely timid. The only problem with Missy is that she had a little bit of a body odor problem. And because of this body odor problem, she had her own can of doggy deodorant. One day when I was home from college, I walked in with my giant portfolio briefcase, set it down, and put my can of Super 77 on the shelf in my parents' garage. Came in, made myself at home, was getting ready for a relaxed weekend, when all of a sudden I heard blood-curdling screams from the backyard. I thought someone had been murdered. I ran back in the yard to see what was going on, and there was Missy, standing there, very timid, while my mother was screaming. As I walked closer, I realized Missy had been sprayed with 3M Super 77, and she was sticky, industrial strength sticky. And grass and leaves and sticks were starting to actually stick to her. It's a total disaster. What do you do with an extremely sticky dog? All of this happened because of one incorrect assumption. My mom assumed that she was going to walk in the garage and grab the same can that she had grabbed over and over, hundreds of times before. It had become something ingrained in her brain, and she didn't question the fact that it was going to be something different this time. Assumptions often lead to bias. And a bias is a preference for one thing over another. Oftentimes in our industry, we talk about bias as being these very heavy subjects, like gender bias, for example. But today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how small bias can actually add up to bigger impact over time. The little assumptions we have every day can actually make a very big impact on the decisions we make. Hi, I'm Samantha Warren, and I'm the Senior Experience Design Manager for Adobe, Stock, and Typekit. We're part of a centralized design team at Adobe that actually works in concert to work with all of our different product teams. There are lots of different products at Adobe. And this story is going to really start with confronting my bias. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about how the story I just told you about impacts an experience I had recently, and then walk you through a case study of how it impacted my team and how we executed upon it, and then show you the results. It all starts with a product called Typekit. It was founded about 10 years ago by two brothers. They wanted to fix fonts for the web. Back then, you could only use a handful of fonts online, like Arial and Verdana. As someone who loved typography, this really drove me crazy. I was so excited to be able to use more than a handful of fonts on the web. A few years in, Adobe actually acquired Typekit and used its technology to syndicate fonts throughout all of their Adobe applications, which they call the Creative Cloud. So InDesign, Illustrator, Photoshop, all of those applications together rely on services, and this technology was used to deliver fonts to those services. And I was a really big fan of Typekit. I mean, like one of the biggest Typekit loyalists. If there was a brand to be a loyalist about, it was Typekit for me. I had t-shirts, and I talked about it everywhere I went. I was like, can you believe this product exists? It's amazing. So much so that Typekit actually sent a camera crew out to my house, and they interviewed me and put the video on the front of their website. If you're offered a seat on a rocket ship, don't ask what seat, just get on. I love this quote by Sheryl Sandberg because it describes exactly how I felt when the opportunity came to me to work on Creative Cloud. A few months after Typekit sent that videographer out to my house, I had the opportunity to actually take a job at Adobe. And being someone who loves design and typography, I thought that this was the greatest opportunity because I'm the quintessential user, right? Well, that's where it all starts, where I actually started to have to question my own bias. Because the first thing I learned was that Adobe's customers, the people who use the tools that Adobe creates, they're actually not just creative professionals like me. It's not just designers. It's all of the different people who make things. People like marketers and videographers. Vlad was talking a little bit about the future of who will be creating these things, and that's actually who are using Adobe products. All sorts of people, even outside of the folks in this room. Secondly, I learned that people who knew about Typekit like I did, they actually weren't always as happy as me about it. Many of them complained a lot about their plans. You see, it was a little bit confusing. You got different fonts with different Creative Cloud subscriptions, and you had to sometimes upgrade for your different fonts. It was a little bit of a mess. And who could blame folks? Because this was our plans page. It was very confusing, and it was outside of the normal Creative Cloud's plans pages. I was stunned to learn that only a small group of Creative Cloud users were using Typekit. And that's kind of crazy, considering the fact that over 70% of people who use Adobe Illustrator actually interact with the type tool. That means that they could benefit from fonts. And there are lots of fonts in the Typekit product. This is crazy, considering the fact that fonts are actually in Adobe's DNA. This is John Warnock. He founded the company back in 1982. And he actually founded it to solve the font problem. Vlad also mentioned in his presentation a little thing called PostScript. And that's what John Warnock actually came up with to build the company Adobe on. It was first this ability to be able to fix rendering fonts in the digital world and then printing them. I began to realize, after learning all of this, that Adobe wasn't really reaching its full potential. We had a massive opportunity ahead of us. We could make fonts available for everyone, help everyone no matter what they were making, whether it be a website or a brochure or just a resume, help them to really level up in their creative pursuits. Adobe is really the only company appropriately positioned to be able to fix fonts for everyone. I knew that I had to break my bias in order to do this. As being someone who loves fonts way too much for my own good, I had a really strong bias towards this product. And so I decided to go out and just do something on my own. I went out and found 5 people not like me, and I decided to just talk to them. These are all people who used Creative Cloud, but maybe they did something different than I do with it. You know, whether they're a marketer or maybe a creative professional and they didn't necessarily know as much about fonts as I did. So I took each of these people and I plotted them on a spectrum from type novice, and then I put myself at the end as a type nerd so that I could always understand where I sat in comparison to the people I was going to talk to. And I just went out and started talking to folks, and I tried to record it. And this was very scrappy. It wasn't a scientific research project. It was just something I wanted to do for myself so that I could understand where I stood. And the first person I talked to was Tony. Full disclosure, Tony is my sister. But she uses Creative Cloud pretty regularly in her role. She's an entrepreneur and a marketer. And she knows how important it is for fonts to be on brand. She wants to look professional in marketing her startup to other people. So things to know about Tony is that her company has a font called Source Sans Pro that they use as their brand font. It was actually chosen by her co-founder, who is a creative. She actually has Source Sans Pro as part of her Creative Cloud subscription. It's part of the Typekit library. And really, she shouldn't be thinking about fonts. She runs a company, right? She's a business person and a marketer. She has a lot of things on her plate. So why is she even thinking about fonts in the first place? So I went and talked to Tony, and I'm going to play a video here of a snippet from our conversation.
Yeah, from Google Font, right? I think. Yeah, I just Googled it, and then I added it to my Typekit.
So yeah, I asked Tony where she got Sora Sans Pro, because I knew she already had it, and clearly she was a little unsure of exactly where she got it. So I then asked her to show me how she went about getting it, because again, it's part of her Creative Cloud subscription. I know exactly where she needs to go to get it, but I want to see where she thinks she needs to go to get it.
But so I just Googled source on, is it this one? Pro? And then, yeah, so here's my Typekit, right? Oh, here's Google Fonts. I'll just grab it.
Woo! She kind of psyched us out there. I thought for a second she might be going to Typekit, and then she still went to Google Fonts. And what's crazy on top of that is that that's actually Paul. And Paul is a type designer at Adobe. And Source Sans Pro is an Adobe font. Adobe actually makes fonts on top of making software. So not only was this a situation where she went to Google Fonts for our font, our Adobe font, but she wasn't really sure what exactly she was doing, really. So I had some takeaways from the 5 interviews I did. First of all, no one really thinks this fonts as being hard, but it's really painful to watch them use them. Even users who knew about Typekit, they didn't really know exactly what it was. Most of them thought it was a marketplace where you go to buy fonts. And even those people who had Creative Cloud oftentimes didn't know that they got all of these fonts free with their subscription. And everyone, no matter who we talked to, whether it was a pro or a hobbyist, they loved seeing font inspiration. This interview process really blew my mind, because I knew no matter what we did, we couldn't fix this with just the pixels that we normally move as designers. There wasn't anything I could change on the website. As you saw in that video from Tony, there was a lot that she didn't understand even before she got to our website, and she may have never made it there. I knew that we had to change direction. We had to do something to fix this. I mean, fonts are in Adobe's DNA. Adobe fixed print fonts, Typekit fixed web fonts. It was our turn to fix fonts for everyone. And so this is how we did it. This is the team that actually works on Typekit at Adobe. It's a very small team. It's me, a really experienced program manager, and 2 absolutely amazing senior designers. We're a pretty small team, and as I said earlier, we're a centralized design team. So we work with a larger product, engineering, and business team. We have folks in this group who are everything from business folks who work with foundries to type designers and engineers. You can see there in the middle, that's Paul. So we knew we needed to get all of these folks on board. There was just one little problem. You see, most of that team, they were actually a lot like me. They had been making a product for themselves, a boutique product for people who love fonts. And so we decided to embark on a process that we referred to as strategic empathy. We needed to scale up the experience that I had in watching all those different videos and really get everyone else on board. So we had a workshop. We flew in people from all over the world. We got them all in a room for one day. We fed them some catering. And we showed them all the videos that I had of the conversations. We introduced them to each person. We gave them little bios. We watched them laugh when they were having great successes with their products and fonts. And we got really, really sad when we watched how difficult it was for them to do what they wanted to do. We printed out quotes from each of the different interviewees, and we put them up on a whiteboard. We then went around the room and took a marker and wrote our names on Post-its, and then posted those Post-its on the quotes that each resonated with each other. And so we'd go around the room and talk a little bit about why a particular quote might really relate to each other. And then we drew an experience, or a journey map up on the whiteboard, where we went through and mapped what each of those people's journeys should have looked like if it was actually an ideal experience. Sometimes as designers, We lead from the front. We give direction and say what people should be doing. But this was a situation where we were really trying to lead through facilitation. We needed to come up with the conditions to help people have the realization on their own. We needed to change hearts and minds without telling people to do anything. And that's what we did here. We helped them to feel for our users. And then something magical happened. The roadmap changed. No one from my team said, let's change the roadmap. Everybody just knew at that moment we had to do something different. And Fonts for All became the entire Typekit team's mission. Sometimes getting your stakeholders to change their mind about the strategy is the hard part. But in this situation, actually executing on that new mission was really challenging. As a small team of designers, you might think that we would be focused on the user interface design, and sometimes maybe the product. But in order to really make the impact that we needed to make in this situation, we had to really affect the entire experience, which included business and brand, too. And so we knew we had to work differently. We looked at those 4 pillars and realized that we needed to come up with a framework. And the challenge with this framework was that actually each of these pillars, they translated into many different teams with very different stakeholders. So we tried to make sure that we were focusing on users first, and then strategy, implementing tactics, and then always having measurable results. And so we started with the business. We started with Josh, who was actually one of the users that we saw in one of his first tweets, where he was explaining how difficult it was for him to understand our plans. It was really difficult for most people to figure out what fonts they got with their plan, and so we decided to really lead the way. We knew that the business structure was very complicated, and that in order to fix it, we needed to simplify. And so that became our strategy. A simplified user experience would actually help with engagement and retention over time. The business of fonts is actually pretty complicated, but why do our customers need to know that? With any marketplace, there's 2 different sides to the marketplace. Every time someone uses a font, there's actually a font foundry that needs to get paid. But we wanted to make sure it was super dead simple. And so we decided to start working one-on-one, spending a lot of time with leadership and in business meetings, making sure that at every turn we were making sure that everyone was considering the user impact of the decisions being made and discussed. And we would do little things like mock up something like this. It's a font card. We would show how just a small change could actually make a really big impact on how someone perceives our business model. For example, here you can see in the bottom right, we would try lots of different types of UI elements and words to help really craft a story around what had changed with our business model. And we showed this to business stakeholders all throughout the process. And so the results when we announced were that we decided to let everyone have unlimited syncing and unlimited page views for our product. No more 100 sync limit for when you were using Adobe Fonts. Next was experience design for the product. And this was one that we had more experience in. We really let Sonia lead the way here. In this situation, Sonia was a creative professional but didn't necessarily have a deep, in-depth knowledge of typography. She was oftentimes starting in an application like Illustrator or InDesign, then choosing fonts, and then outputting the work that she was creating. And so we wanted to make sure that not only were we showing the screens that we were designing, but what was happening before and after she was choosing fonts, and even about the different websites she'd go to get inspiration. We wanted to make sure that we were really positioning our product more as a service and not just a destination. This way, it really focused on the user's workflows. We would put together slides like this. When we had 5 minutes with a major executive, we'd try to show them that, hey, fonts aren't actually as easy as you think. This is the decision tree that someone like Rumesa has to go through in order to decide on what font she's going to use when creating a project. At the same time, in parallel, we were actually also working with the Adobe Illustrator team, trying to make fonts look more visual within the application. So we talked a lot about how this could make major impacts on how people actually browse for fonts in the Adobe applications and tools. And with that, we announced tighter desktop integration when we made the big announcement. Next, we thought about experience design for the user interface. Again, a place where we really had a little bit more experience. And we let Carrie, who is a hobbyist, really lead the way here. Carrie talked about how much she loved going out and finding inspiration around fonts before she made something. And she'd go to all these different places like Pinterest or Google Images in order to decide what font she was going to use. We realized that friendly visuals and natural language would really help make the product a lot more easier to use. And natural language really comes from the fact that when we talk to people, they weren't saying words like modernist sans serif. They were saying, I'm looking for a fun font, or a curvy font, or a funky font. We needed to make some changes in order to really accommodate this, because when you give people 15,000 fonts all at one time, they want to be able to actually choose and chunk them in a much easier, digestible way. So we designed what we called curated font packs. Font packs were essentially what they sound like, a group of fonts that were designed around a theme, perhaps by a curated individual, like a designer in the industry, or by us around a particular idea. And you could download all of those fonts at one time and see a beautiful visual of the fonts in use before you downloaded them. And actually, I went ahead and curated my own font pack. If you're interested in finding some fonts around retro glamping, I've got you covered here. In case you're going to Yosemite and you want to stay in a 60s cabin, that's what I curated my font pack around. And so in the end, when we announced it as part of really the fact that we were giving people 15,000 fonts at one time, and that we were making it a little bit easier for them to find the font they were needing. And then lastly, we thought about the experience design for brand, which was an area that product designers don't really get the opportunity to dabble in very often. And we looked to Tony as really our guide here, because even though she didn't say that the brand was the problem, later in her interview, she talked a little bit about Typekit, and she was a bit confused about where it might be. Is it on her desktop? Does she search for it in her Finder? Maybe it's in the little drop-down from Creative Cloud at the top of the screen. She wasn't clear on exactly what Typekit was because of the name. We decided to introduce a brandless brand so that we could actually think about fonts more as a service and not just a destination or product. And we worked with our brand team to really visualize what the impact of this could mean across all the different touch points. We also talked about the fact that most people we talked to didn't use the word type, which was in our name. They used the word fonts. And so we would mock up all different scenarios where you would see this new potential brand, and then we actually really pitched the idea, what if it didn't have a visual at all? What if it just was Adobe Fonts? And in the end, that was the big announcement. We announced Typekit was now Adobe Fonts. And I killed the brand I loved. Thank you. And to some extent, you could say I killed my bias as well. I'm now the Senior Experience Design Manager for Adobe Stock and Fonts, and we announced this back in October. This is Scott Belsky, our head of product, announcing it. It was one of the most thrilling moments in my career. We've seen 36% growth year over year, and something we didn't expect happened after that announcement. Customer support inquiries went down a lot. People just weren't as confused anymore about it. That was all great, but what I'm really the most excited about is the impact it's made within our company. Now people think of fonts as an integrated part of the entire Adobe ecosystem. So no matter what app you're using, our team gets pulled in to think about how fonts could actually help users meet their creative goals in a better and more meaningful way. From this experience, I learned that becoming aware of even your smallest biases can help transform your point of view and your mission. That spreading empathy, while it sounds cliche and it's a bit of a buzzword, it really does help to drive positive change. And more importantly, the experience, it really is more than just the pixels. So when you're sitting there looking at the screen and thinking about just the pixels that you're designing, think about the broader impact. And in order to do that, your team might have to work differently. It may be a whole new model that you have to think about. Do you guys remember Missy? She's got the glue in her hair. So assumptions and bias got us into this problem, but maybe letting go of them could get us out. How do you get 3M Super 77 out of a schnauzer's hair? So at the age of 20, when this all happened to me, I thought that putting nail polish remover on the schnauzer was a good idea. Luckily, we didn't do that. My mom warned me. So I decided to call the 3M Super 77 customer service line, where I was greeted with silence and then roaring laughter. They thought that I should put canola oil on the dog, like giving the dog a bath in canola oil. And since an oily dog was no better really than a sticky dog in my mind, I decided to try and think outside the box on this. We had assumed this whole time that you had to put something on the dog to get the stickiness out, but that was our bias. So I went out similarly, and I asked people some questions about what they would do in this situation. And in getting the other people's point of view, my dad actually came to me with the right idea, which was that in this situation, you don't put something on the dog, you actually shave the dog. You didn't know you were going to get a picture like this today, did you? That's some Photoshop skills right there, right? I still got it. In the end, this was a lighthearted story, but with a very serious case study. We changed the way we worked, and hopefully you find it helpful in the way you work every day. Thank you so much.
Literally, the first question was, what happened to the dog? So
I couldn't leave you hanging.
You answered that. Okay, so Adam asks, how did you avoid bias during the workshop?
Oh, yeah. So we really didn't invite a lot of collaboration until we went through really listening first. We actually positioned it originally as a listening workshop, just so that we could sit and hear what people had to say. And so there was bias, of course. We all bring bias to what we do every day, but there was a lot of counterpoints. And so it was about really presenting the counterpoint to every single specific point of view that someone brought to the table. Even myself, I think that's the most important thing, was just really making sure everybody was open to considering other points of view.
Wonderful. Benjamin asks, what do you think of Roboto?
Roboto the font? It's a nice font. Sans serif. These days.
I had to ask that on stage. I'm sorry. I just had to do it.
Yeah, I don't have as many of opinions about fonts as I used to. I just really like to find the really clever ones. So I'm really into Ono type right now.
Oh, cool. Okay, we got some yelling out.
We got some really passionate font folks in the
Yeah,
audience.
we do. Yeah.
Fonts get people riled up.
Okay, so who from leadership was involved when design was proposing to change the business case?
Yeah, so there were a lot of different phases to that particular segment, and a lot of it we were involved in, but really there were some specific leaders who drove that for us, and lucky for us, being folks who care a lot about fonts, they're also people who care a lot about design. And so they knew how important it was to have design as part of the entire process. And so it was our head of business, our head of foundry relations. They really did a lot of the championing for this. Once they figured out how we could make this happen, they were the ones who really led with it. And we just really came along to make sure that when we were proposing crazy stuff to leadership like VPs and SVPs, that they could see what the implications were for the customer, and that it was really, in the end, a benefit for the customer.
Wonderful. What was the most difficult component to change while making the case to change the business model to be more user-focused?
What's the most difficult component of the business change? I think for us, it was about how do you take this product that had been existing for about 10 years and make a lot of subtle changes that would really translate into people understanding what the business change was. I think, anytime you have, I think someone earlier talked about, like, with enterprise, you have to think about people don't like change, right? And so we wanted to make sure that not only we were making changes that supported the business model, but also communicated that change so people understood what was going on. The tricky thing about fonts is that you have to make sure that every time you use a font, someone should get paid for that, right? Someone made it. It's a piece of, Adobe is very creative centric, right? So it's not just about the creators who are using the products, it's also the creators that create, and they should also get paid too. So there's a very important aspect of making sure that people who are using stuff, we don't want to be in their face about them saying like, hey, somebody's got to get paid for this, but it's also about building that reputation and understanding of what you're doing and how it's working, and that this is actually something you're licensing from another creative.
Wonderful. When you have different levels of users, novice, intermediate, expert, how do you generalize language so that it makes sense for everyone? Do you go with the lowest common denominator?
Well, I think one of the things we learned in this process, and we're still learning a lot here, is that there's assumptions made about what is general language, right? And so we do a lot of user testing. We talk to a lot of users. We listen a lot. So a lot of it is just kind of finding that medium, like finding what the middle ground is. We're not always right, and we're still experimenting. I would love for us to continue to experiment with the language we're using, but it's not necessarily about the lowest common denominator. It's about just what resonates with people the most and really talking to them to find out, why it resonates with them.
Wonderful. Let's give Samantha another round of applause. And